Recently I put out a video discussing how Sonic the Hedgehog 3 has intentionally been buried by Sega, possibly out of fear of legal troubles from people who helped produce music for the game's soundtrack. That video's focus was mostly on the best way to still play Sonic 3, but I like to talk about a game's history to give context on why there needs to be a video explaining how to play the game. If you haven't seen that video, I recommend checking it out. I'll link it in the description, and it'll probably show up as a link at the end of this video. You don't have to watch it to understand what I'm about to talk about, but it might help. A lot of that video's focus is around the music of Sonic 3. At some point in Sonic 3's development, Sega allegedly announced and then immediately retracted a statement that they were collaborating with Michael Jackson for the game's soundtrack. Though Michael himself is not directly credited, 6 people known to produce Michael's music are credited, as is Michael Jackson's coordinator, Mayumi Nina Sakazaki. Simply put, Michael Jackson undeniably worked on Sonic 3's soundtrack, and it's likely there are legal issues stemming from that soundtrack that are preventing the game's re-release. With recent information coming to light and questions from people who watched that video, I wanted to take a little bit of time to do a simple video podcast to talk about that in greater detail. This isn't going to be a super highly produced thing, just me talking about stuff with maybe a bit of video here and there to demonstrate. So if that sounds boring or whatever, don't feel bad about closing the tab. I just don't want a reply like this to take months to put together, because videos like that are a lot of effort. So while producing that video, a Sonic Retro user named DRX released the very first Sonic 3 prototype ever discovered. That prototype is notable for reasons I'll get to in a second, but the first thing you have to know is that I've kind of been working on that Sonic 3 video since like May or June of 2019, when the very first version of Angel Island Revisited came out. Basically, I wrote the script and then sat on it for a few months because I had other things that I needed to take care of. When DRX released the Sonic 3 prototype, I was probably around 70 to 80% complete on my video. I could have fit in a segment to talk about the prototype and what it means for what we know about Sonic 3's music, but that would have delayed the video and I wanted it out before Thanksgiving of 2019. The holiday season is very important on YouTube because advertising revenue goes way up, and I needed to get the video out there before Black Friday started. Ideally, I would have had it ready to go in October, but things just didn't work out. This prototype sheds some new light on Sonic 3's development process. A summary is that Sonic Team began work on Sonic 3 a few months after they finished work on Sonic 2, and they spent almost 5 months building a brand new isometric 3D game for the Sega Genesis using something called the SVP chip, which was short for the Sega Virtua processor. The SVP chip was going to be Sega's answer to Nintendo's Super Effects chip, in that it would have allowed 3D games to be made for the Genesis. The original version of Sonic 3 was going to be one of the very first 3D games for the SVP chip, but Sega ended up delaying production and Sonic Team had to scrap that version of the game and start over. To this day, the original SVP version of Sonic 3 has never been shown publicly. Nobody knows what it looked like, it's all just speculation. It was now June, and Sega needed Sonic the Hedgehog 3 to release in February of 1994 because they had a marketing promotion with McDonald's and they couldn't miss the deadline. Because it takes time to manufacture game cartridges, Sonic Team had roughly from June to November to make an entire game. So 5 months, when most games, even back then, took 12 months or longer. It was a very short, very grueling development process, something that's represented in this prototype that was released. The prototype is dated only a few weeks before the November deadline, and the game is a mess of incomplete levels and broken features. Nothing at all like what you'd expect from a game that should be nearing the end of its development. DRX has published a much longer, more in-depth article about all of this that I will be linking in the description. Where this ties into my video and the status of Sonic 3's music is despite the fact that this build was apparently made in October, near the end of the game's development, it does not yet feature any of Michael Jackson's music. Instead, it features music that was later used in Sonic & Knuckles collection on the PC, suggesting that the music used in that version of the game was secretly Sonic 3 prototype music all along, and nobody actually knew that until now. It's pretty crazy. This obviously raises many questions about Michael Jackson's involvement in Sonic 3. Sega of America's Roger Hector has said in the past that Michael was kicked off of Sonic 3 because of the child molestation reports that came out during the game's development. Given that this prototype build of Sonic 3 contains an October 1993 date, that puts it after the reports that came out against Michael. That suggests, at least to me, that there was a time where Sega was trying to replace Michael Jackson's music entirely, and at some point between October 1993 and November 1993, those songs ended up in the game anyway. As of this recording, we don't know why that is. Despite the October date in the prototype, there's other information to suggest that some of this data could have been from a much earlier version of the game, so maybe some of it does predate Michael's involvement with the Sonic 3 soundtrack. Again, we don't know. This prototype provides more questions than answers when it comes to Sonic 3's music. That became a major reason why I chose not to go back and include any mention of the prototype in my video. Instead, I went with what I already had, which was solid information that pointed towards an answer. We know Michael Jackson's people made music for Sonic 3. We know that music made it into the final game. And we know that some of the people that worked on that music are upset with Sega. It's already a long, complex video, so there was no need to muddy things up with more questions and fewer answers. As for why Sega kept re-releasing new versions of Sonic 3 with music they might not have had a license for, that's also a mystery I don't necessarily have an answer for, outside of the fact that music licensing can be weird like that. It was long rumored that the music licensing for Sonic 1 and 2 was also held up for a while too. The musician behind those games was a man named Masato Nakamura, and he was part of one of the biggest pop music bands in all of Japan, called Dreams Come True. Directly following the release of Sonic the Hedgehog 2, Dreams Come True released an album that would go on to become one of the best-selling Japanese pop music albums of all time. So they were a pretty big deal. The rumor was that because Nakamura's band became so popular, he began charging Sega massive licensing fees for using the music he composed for Sonic 1 and 2. The only real verification we have for that is Sonic Spinball. Sonic Spinball was developed by Sega of America, and early versions of that game contain a version of the Sonic the Hedgehog theme composed by Masato Nakamura. Sega of Japan told Sega of America that they weren't allowed to use that song, so a new Sonic Spinball theme was composed by Howard Drawson to replace it. Obviously, Sega got to keep re-releasing Sonic 1 and 2 without having to change the music or get into any legal trouble, and that's where music licensing can be so complicated. The way I understand it is, when it comes to music, you license the song itself and the performance of the song separately. So let's say you want to use Queen's We Are the Champions. First, you pay to license the song itself, which is the notes and the lyrics. Then, on top of that, you also license Queen's actual performance of the song, meaning Freddie Mercury's voice and the band members playing their instruments. In some cases, each band member is a separate performance that you have to license individually, making their songs very expensive. With Masato Nakamura's music for Sonic 1 and 2, he would compose the music at his studio and then send the recordings to Sega, where Sega's sound engineering team would translate Nakamura's music to work on the Sega Genesis. So, for example, Nakamura would produce music in his studio that sounded like this. and then Sega's sound engineering team would produce this as the finished product. In short, Nakamura owned the notes because he created the song, but Sega owned the performance because their sound engineers translated the music. Theoretically, this allowed Sega to keep publishing new versions of Sonic 1 and 2 as long as it contained the original FM synthesizer music from the Sega Genesis. They could not produce any new remixes or remasters for that music. It had to stay in its original format because Sega owned that performance. That eventually changed around the time Sonic Generations was released. Sega actually brought Masato Nakamura out on stage for the announcement of Sonic Generations, and it kinda seemed to be a symbol of the two burying the hatchet, so to speak. Sega may have even bought the rights to Nakamura's music at this time, given that after Sonic Generations, Sega seemed to be freely using those songs and themes in more games. But again, we don't know enough about Michael Jackson's involvement with Sonic 3 to say how this affects that game's music. It's possible Sega thought they owned the performance rights to Sonic 3's music, but maybe they actually don't. That would have created a scenario where Sega was technically using Michael Jackson's Sonic 3 music illegally for decades. That would also create a scenario where they owe people unpaid money for that game. It may also just be a recent thing. Since Michael Jackson's death, his estate has kinda gone on the warpath, trying to lock down unauthorized uses of Michael's work. They've been flinging lawsuits at everyone from HBO to Disney for any number of alleged breaches of contracts or whatever. It's possible Sega is just trying to keep their heads down to avoid being the next target. And there are lots of more reasons too. Maybe Michael Jackson contributed to Sonic 3 in secret, due to contractual obligations with his publishing label. Michael Jackson had cameos in lots of things back in the day that never actually credited him by name, and that's because he was locked into a contract to only make content for certain corporations. If Sega ever actually admitted Michael worked on the game, that could get them in trouble too. Who knows, maybe it's even that Sega's been paying licensing to Michael Jackson all along, and since Michael died, that money hasn't been going to the right people anymore. That could also be a possibility that would get them in trouble. Whatever the case is, it really seems like Sega thought they were in the clear, and that has now changed enough that they are running scared. And you have to remember that this isn't the first time something like this has happened. Sonic 3 disappeared off the Wii Virtual Console for a while too, before eventually resurfacing after a few years. I think the same thing happened to the Xbox Live Arcade version of Sonic 3 too. We should all keep in mind that there are things going on behind the scenes that none of us know about, and from their perspective, Sega has a good reason to be acting this way. As for the possibility of Sega using the prototype Sonic 3 music to sidestep the legal issues involved with Michael Jackson's music, you have to realize that it's not that easy there either. Most game developers back then never thought they'd ever need to archive their source code for later, so modifying Sonic 3 to change out the music is a lot more difficult than simply copying over some files. You'd essentially have to hack the game, which is easier said than done, especially when it comes to a big corporation like Sega. First, they'd have to find someone who understands raw machine code inside of a Sega Genesis. This person would be required to understand how to interpret the music data in both versions of the game so that it could be transferred without breaking any of the existing code. It's a very delicate, difficult process. Not only does the person have to be highly skilled at hacking Sega Genesis games, but it has to be someone that Sega trusts to do the job. They can't just hire some random person off the street because they might do a bad job, or worse, they might insert malicious code into the game. They'd have to find a person that is guaranteed to do the job correctly. Second, who composed the prototype music? For reasons possibly related to Michael Jackson's involvement, Sega has rarely gone into detail for who composed what songs in Sonic 3. We know that people like Jun Seno and Howard Drawson and Brad Buxer all contributed music to Sonic 3, but Sega has never told anyone which specific songs they were responsible for. Now, you have to remember, Sonic 3 was originally developed 25 years ago, and it was developed in a hurry. They might not have even kept records of this stuff, and even if they did, where are those records now? How organized are they? Does anyone working at Sega today know where to find out who composed what music? Because Sega can't just use the prototype music like it's theirs. There is a process that they must go through to find the original composers and at the very least get their blessing. You might think that's crazy, but that's how this works. Konami went through the same trouble with their Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arcade games. They re-released them on the GameCube, but whoever originally composed the music wouldn't let them use his work, so they had to replace the soundtracks. And when Ubisoft did the HD remake of Turtles in Time for the Xbox 360, they were also blocked from using the original music. Even Sega was blocked from some of Sonic CD's Japanese music because they weren't allowed to use some of the vocal performances for the 2011 Retro Engine remake. Sega will absolutely need to find and contact the original people that made the prototype music and probably at least notify them or something. Doing both those steps, finding a hacker to hack the music, and finding who even created the music to begin with, those things cost time and effort and money that Sega obviously doesn't want to spend for one reason or another. You might think that sucks, but that's also business. Business sucks. You have to see it from their perspective. I mentioned that Konami replaced the soundtracks to their Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles games, and people hated it. People hated it when the new versions of Super Meat Boy replaced the soundtrack a few years ago. Sega got to experience this firsthand when they remastered Crazy Taxi and had to replace all of the music. You'll notice they never went on to remaster Crazy Taxi 2 or 3, right? When you're running a business, you look at trends like this. If Sega went through all the effort and money of releasing a version of Sonic 3 with different music, it would be a noose around that game's neck and nobody would ever shut up about it. So, in Sega's eyes, it's not worth it. It sucks, but business sucks. Game development is not a magical candy land where good ideas are automatically granted passage. I'm not saying that makes any of this okay, just that this is what happens. These companies are made by people confident in their methods for making money, and sometimes things like this slip through the cracks. They obviously know there's a demand for Sonic 3 as there was that whole huge petition with tens of thousands of signatures, but it's just not in the cards, otherwise they would have done it by now. Anyway, that's basically all I wanted to say. I knew about the prototype and I know it's a hot button talking point these days, but it did not significantly change what I wanted to say in my video. My videos are more about the history of why a game is unplayable, not a summary of the game's entire development. If that was the case, that Sonic 3 video would be easily an hour long. It kind of is if you count this podcast as part of it. And yeah, I don't think there's much Sega can do to re-release Sonic 3. I mean, there are things that they can do, but from a business perspective, it probably doesn't seem like it's worth the effort to release a gutted version of one of Sonic's greatest games. There is no winning scenario here. Sega got themselves into trouble, and dealing with that trouble could be very damaging to the company. Because if you didn't know, Sega isn't what they once were. They have good years and bad years, but sometimes it really feels like Sega has more bad years than good ones, you know? They might not have a lot of money on hand to deal with the legal ramifications of this stuff. Like I said, nobody wins. And of course, nobody really knows what's going on anyway. That's the most important takeaway in all of this. Sega is clearly hiding something, and we only really have snippets of what it could be. It could be something else entirely. We just don't know, and from where Sega is sitting, that's the point. We aren't supposed to know. They would rather pretend that there's no problem at all, even when that's obviously not true. But again, that's business. Anyway, I've never been good at ending podcasts. But if you somehow heard this and didn't see the main video it's referencing, now would be a good time to go watch that. If you want more long-winded replies to things, you can always hit up my Tumblr Ask blog, and there's a link in the description. I'm also on Twitter, and I tweet out a lot of garbage. You can also donate on Patreon to get early access to more podcasts from me, though they do eventually come to YouTube anyway. All of this is linked in the description. Anyway, bye!